Today, many of us, I won't say many of us, all of us, we know what today is. Uh, we celebrate today as Mother's Day, but it's the first day of the week. But I thought it interesting, we talked about Jesus' mother just a few weeks ago and how important, and sometimes we talked about how that sometimes we might shy away from that because other religious organizations hold Mary up as something special. We know that she wasn't, but it's important. It was really important that Mary gave birth, the virgin birth to Jesus. But as we start and we think about that this morning, I want to read a verse to you in Isaiah 66, verse 13. I was talking to Bill on Wednesday night, and Bill made the comment. He said, I just can't get away from Isaiah. Man, there's just so much in there. And I'll tell you, that's kind of one of the things that aggravates me about this whole study is there's just so many different ways, and every point you get to, you want to go and study that thing out and run that as far as you can run it, and you don't have time because you got to get back to what you're doing. So I guess that's a good kind of an aggravation. But in Isaiah chapter 66 and verse 13, this is a verse that makes me think about this, about the day that it is today. It reads, and remember this, as these are words of God. Verse 13 reads, as one whom his mother comforts, so I will comfort you, and you shall be comforted in Jerusalem. What I want you to notice about that verse is that verse compares God's comforting love to the way a mother comforts her child. Well, we can think about that deep connection and that care that a mother offers when we think about that. And I think that's important for us to think about on a day like today. We're fortunate to get to be together today and to study from God's Word. And that's one thing we do each first day of the week and in the middle of the week. And we're just fortunate to do that. I see there are several mothers in the audience that aren't usually here, and I'm glad to see that. We'll start this class, and we're ready for lesson 6. The title is Christ, the Prophet and Teacher. This lesson is just like all the rest. It's hard to talk about Christ without talking about Him being a prophet. And it's hard to separate that from Him being a prophet and being a teacher. And all that's just kind of intermingled together. So it may look like we're jumping on each side of the porch there, but that's just what we're going to do. We'll start out with our memory verse. I haven't memorized it. I'm working on it, but what I've noticed is the older you get, it's harder to memorize stuff. I thought I was the only one, but it just is. But here it is. It's Acts 3 and 18. It says, but the things which God announced beforehand by the mouth of all the prophets, that His Christ should suffer, He has thus fulfilled. What I want you to remember about that is Christ is the Messiah, He's the anointed one, and He is our deliverer. And that is a good thing. I can just tell you that the things, and we're going to start here in Deuteronomy 18 here in just a few minutes. So if you want to be turning there, Deuteronomy, the 18th chapter. But I want to just tell you, when we talk about today and we talk about mothers, and I think we'll understand how this connects and how this ties in. But it reminds me, when we read the verse in Isaiah, and we talk about our mothers, and today's Mother's Day, and that is a good thing. And I understand that there are folks that didn't have good mothers. I understand that. I did not have that. I have a very good mother, and I'm glad for that. I'm appreciative of that, and as many of you do. But there are some people who didn't. But the fact of the matter is, they still had a mother. And if that person chooses to live for God, they're still honoring their mother, whether the mother was any good or not. So remember that. But I was talking this week to a few guys, and they preached for a long, long time. One of them happened to say, we've talked about different versions of the Bible. And I've changed through the years what I use. Used to use Old King James, and all things that I remember, that's what I remember them out of, is the King James. And that's difficult when you're studying out something else. because the words that you remember, they don't match what you're looking at. But that's all right. But one of them said, and you've heard me say this before, one of them said, I always liked my mother's version of the Bible the best. We're all like, we didn't know your mother had a version of the Bible. He said, oh yeah. My mother had a version of the Bible, and I liked it the best. He said the version she had, she lived it. Oh boy, that's a pretty good version, isn't it? I had a friend one time, and she said she always used to hate it when her mother would correct them because she always did it with the Bible. She said, my mother knew the Bible so well, she would quote, she said, the kids would be fighting and beating one another up, and her mother would stop and start quoting the Bible to them. She said, I always hated that. But it meant, as she got older, that meant something to her. She appreciated that. But the men who I were talking to, we were talking about how to reach people. And their comments, and they've been preaching and teaching for a long, long time. And they said, used to, what you had to worry about and what you had to fill your mind with was how to combat denominational doctrines. And I think that's true. And they made this statement. They said, Brett, today that's not the case. And the more we talk, the more I agree. And I agree with them. I agree. That's not the case today. But and here's why they said that. They said, the things that we have to talk about today, when we're talking to people, a lot of them don't even believe the Bible. A lot of them, they have no religious affiliation whatsoever. And so we're talking about, well, what do y'all say? Well, we're talking about Messianic prophecies. They said, that's one of the things that you need to be talking about. That's one of the things you need to be studying. And that's so true, because that fortifies our faith. And it does. It just does that. That's how it operates. But they said, these people that have no idea about anything, they need to know about something. And they need to know about one person. Who's that person? We asked this question before. Who's the person that they need to know about? Christ. Bruce answered that first last time. He didn't this time, but he did last time. Dale did it first this time. They're in a battle. But that's so true. What they need is Christ. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about these Jews in here in a few minutes if we can get that far. If not, we'll do it on Wednesday night. But if we look at Deuteronomy chapter 18 and verse 15. Deuteronomy chapter 18 verse 15. That's where we're going to start. It says, the Lord your God will raise up for you. Notice the next word. One letter. It says, a prophet. Like who? It says, like me. From among you, from your countrymen, you shall listen to him. Now, who's the me there? Who's the me? It's Moses. It's Moses. Now, what about, let's just lay a little groundwork here. God, what this tells us, God was not going to leave Israel's leaderless. He wasn't going to leave them leaderless when Moses died. But He would raise up His own spokesman like Moses. The nation wouldn't be facing the future with no direction, would they? Because they were going to have somebody else like Moses. That key phrase in verse 15 is a prophet like me. Now, we can look in the Old Testament. We won't because of time, but I'll tell you the verses. In the Old Testament, in Deuteronomy 34 and 10, and in the New Testament, in Acts 3:22 and 3:23. You can also look in Acts 7 and 37. We probably ought to read those, but I hope you'll take a note of that and go back and look at those. But that bolsters that in our mind. So Moses is a model for the prophet to come. The future prophet would be characterized by some definite qualities. Now, most people interpret that passage and they refer to the coming Messiah. And in fact, Jesus was like Moses in several different ways. We're going to list some of them in just a minute. And there are many. There are too many similarities for us to mention. We'll mention 5 or 6. I wrote down 6, and we'll talk about one of those in particular. The ways in which Jesus. And well, first of all, I ask this: the folks way back yonder in Bible days, did they put a lot of stock in Moses? Yes. They He had clout with them, didn't he? And that's good. That's a good thing. What also did they put their stock in? Who? This wasn't a person. I'll just say the law. They respected the law, didn't they? Maybe a little too much, but they were respecters of the law and they respected Moses. But here's some ways that Jesus and Moses, here's some things they have in common. Number one, and these are not in any particular order, and there's just as many. Like I say, you could stop at 20 and still not have them all. He was spared death as a baby. Exodus 2, Matthew 2, 13 through 23. He renounced a royal court. Philippians 2, 5 through 8, and Hebrews 11, 24 through 27. He had compassion on his people. I like that one. Numbers 27, 17, and Matthew 9, 36. He made intercession for the people. Deuteronomy 9 and 18, Hebrews 7 and 25. I'm going to skip number 5 because we're going to come back and talk about that in just a minute. He was the mediator of a covenant. Deuteronomy 29, Hebrews 8, 6 and 7. Well, number 5, what I wrote down was he spoke with God face to face. Now, I want to look at these for just a minute. Let's look at Exodus 34. In Exodus 34, verse 29. Exodus 34, verse 29 says, "And it came about when Moses was coming down from Mount Sinai, and the 2 tablets of the testimony were in Moses' hand. And as he was coming down from the mountain, that Moses did not know that the skin of his face shone because of his speaking with him." Who's it talking about? God. Well, let's look over to 2 Corinthians. And like is so, we found so many different times. And I like the fact that Grant said in his Bible, and I looked at mine, it's the same way. There's just a white page in between the Old and New Testament. And that's all there is. There's nothing there. But how connected they are. 2 Corinthians chapter 3. We'll read one verse. 2 Corinthians chapter 3. Verse 7. It says, "But if the ministry of death," now what's that? That's the Old Testament. Sorry, Rose, you had that before I said it. You were saying it. You get credit on that. But back to verse 7. "But if the ministry of death," which is the Old Testament, "in letters, engraved on stones, came with glory, so that the sons of Israel could not look intently at the face of Moses because the glory of his face, fading as it was," that means it was passing away. He spoke face to face with God. We talked about this before. Christ was God, but then Christ was man. Can you imagine? Can you imagine if we were able to look in God's face? How is it that we today can look in the face of God? Through His Word. And what's the Word? Jesus. It's the Word. Jesus is God on foot. And I think that is so important that when we think about the phrase, the Word became flesh, that's important to us. That is very, very important to us. We're going to look here in 2 Corinthians chapter 3. We're going to cruise down through this chapter just a little bit. Beginning in verse 1. Now, I'll ask you a question first. What was it, and the book tells you the answer to this, but what was it that Jesus was? First, He was a what? I mean, not in any order, but what is He? We've already talked about this morning. He's a prophet, and what else is He? He's a teacher. And those, they're hard to interchange, though. I'm not sure that you could be I guess you could be a prophet without being a teacher. And I guess you could be a teacher without being a prophet. But not Jesus. Not when you're Jesus. And we'll talk about that some more here in a minute. But if we look down through here and look at, it says, beginning in verse 1, are we beginning to commend ourselves again, or do we need, as some letters of the commendation, to you or from you? This part is so good in verse 2. You are our letter, written in our hearts, known and read by all men, being manifested that you are a letter of Christ, cared for by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tables of stone. That's what they put their faith in, was those tables of stone. Now, let me ask you a question before we keep reading on there. This ain't a trick question, but you got to think about it. Is there anything? Let me think how I'm going to ask this. Let me ask it like this. Let me ask it like this first. Is there anything in the law that can save your soul? I see some of you with the right answer. You're shaking your head like this, and that's the right answer. Nope. All right, now I'm going to answer it a different way. Is there anything? Now, this is Old and New Testament in between this cover. Is there anything in this that can save your soul? Now, I hear some of you saying yes, but I'm going to say no. And I'll explain to you why. We talked about if we walk up here, I ain't going to walk up on the hill, but I could ride Brian Whiteside's bicycle. It's got a battery in it. I could ride that up there. And I could talk to people who they know this cover to cover. Is it going to save their soul? No. Knowing it will not save their soul, because knowing it puts us in the same, and we can know it. We can know it frontwards, backwards, upside down. We can turn it upside down and read it. We can know it in pig Latin and everything else. But it ain't going to save our soul, is it? I've seen an illustration, I think, that illustrates this good. You know, some people accuse me of going to go to work this morning. I lost one of my gloves this week. I had to get a new pair. These ain't never been used. But I want to ask you something about this glove. Can that glove do anything on its own? Huh? It can't, can it? I mean, most of the time these are stuck on the seat of my truck. And then when I go to get it, there's only one there. And there's 15 left-hand gloves and no right-hand gloves. I told that to Andy, and he said, well, why don't you just turn it around and use it backwards? Sometimes you got to do that. But that glove can't do anything, can it? It can do nothing. It won't even stand on its own. Well, I want you to think about this glove as us. You ever thought about that? You're just a glove. But think about this. My hand is Jesus. Okay? I may should have got a bigger size. All right. Now what can that glove do? What can it do? How many fingers I got up? 2. How many now? Think about the glove as you. Think about my hand as Jesus. Jesus, that's who we're talking about. That's who we've been pointing to. He wants to be in you. You're a glove, see? You see my point. Well, look. This glove won't do that. This glove can't point. It can't hold up 2 fingers. Well, this glove has 4 fingers hanging up, holding up, but, I mean, you know. It's alive. It's alive. So, and maybe that's kooky. That may be kooky, But I'm going to tell you, I understand that. It's simple enough for me to understand that. Jesus wants to be in us. And that makes us living. That's what those guys were talking about. That's how we're going to reach the world. It's not, and don't get me wrong, we need to know what the Scriptures say. We do. And I'll tell you, I believe this study, me and Grant have talked about this a little bit, how there's just so many different facets, so many different spots. And Grant, I meant to say this earlier, Grant did such a great job in talking about John the Baptist because there's just a very little section in the book, but that's so crucial to us. And he did a marvelous job. He needs to add, we need to talk to Brother Durham and get him to put that part in the book because it's important. It could be lesson 14 or lesson 5A or 5B, whatever. But those are important things. But looking to God and looking to Jesus. We left off at the tablets of stone, but on the tablets of the human heart. You see, when those tablets when the tablets of our heart, when Jesus gets in your heart, then He makes it. He points you in the right way. He points you where not to go. Points you where to go. He makes you living. And you know what? When you're using that man's mother's version of the Bible, you know what? You don't have to have a Bible on the seat of the truck. You know what? You live in it. They can see it. And you know what? That makes such an impact. Now, the bad thing, the opposite of that, let me get back to reading this and then we'll talk about that in a minute. And such confidence we have, verse 4, chapter 3, 2 Corinthians, and such confidence we have through Christ toward God. Not that we are adequate in ourselves. Listen to that. Not that we are adequate in ourselves to consider anything as coming from ourselves, but our adequacy is from who? God. Aren't you glad about that? I sure am. Because I know how inadequate I am. But you know, the bad thing about that is, there are times in my life when I thought, oh, I was adequate. That sounds kooky. Because I don't use that word a lot. Well, but you know what I mean by that. I thought I knew so much and I knew everything. Wouldn't it be great? Have you ever thought at any point in time that you knew the answer to every question? Renee, don't say nothing. Because I'll have to say sometimes I think that. Any of you men in here, you might think the same thing, don't you? Philip? Philip don't ever do that. He never thinks that. But sometimes we do. But sometimes we think that way as Christians. But not that we're adequate. We're ready for verse 6. Who also, listen, the end of verse 5, our adequacy is from God, who also made us adequate as servants or ministers, the word diakonos, servants of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. The letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. I can't imagine what it would be like to look into the face of God. But if we get close to Jesus, and if we know His Word, and we have a personal relationship with Him, then we're going to know what God is. Sorry, Brian. Mm-hmm. That's so true. That is so true. That's why some people, and I'm a big prayer. I'm big on prayer. I don't think I think the tool. If we opened a toolbox and said, "Here's our toolbox of things that we're going to fight the devil with," prayer is the most powerful tool in that toolbox because it works. But when I'm off track a little bit, but I want us to understand this. This is about having a relationship with God. When we understand who Jesus is and we get to know Him and we can talk to the Father through Jesus as our friend, not as and don't misunderstand me because I've heard people get up. This is a long time ago and begin a prayer with, "Hey, Dad," and I'm going to tell you something. I don't want to be standing next to you when you start a prayer out like that. I don't think that's wise. I think well, we're treading on ground that we better be careful treading on. We're to be reverent. Just a minute, Brian. We're to be reverent about that. But when we talk to God, we're supposed to pour out our souls, not just read off some rote. And nothing wrong with those phrases that we all say. What are they? Guide, guard, and direct us. Bring us back to the next point of time. Sick and afflicted. What are, you know them? What are some more of them? Oh, yes, ready recollection. What? A hedge of protection, yes. There's nothing wrong with those things. Those are not pouring our heart out to God. There's nothing wrong with saying those things in prayer. But when you're in your closet or you're on your knees or you're sitting in your car and the tears are flowing down your face because some kind of thing is going on in your life or you're tore up because that somebody you know, their son or their daughter fell away from God. When you're doing that, when you are approaching God, that's when you're pouring your heart out. You are not saying those rote things, are you? Brian? Sorry. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. It is. I got to tell you this story, and then we're gonna go to Isaiah. We're gonna go to Isaiah 61 if you want to be turning to that verse 1 and 2. One of the men that I talked to in the last couple of weeks has been preaching about 40 years. He said in his first work, he was 25 years old. And there was a man in the congregation. He was about 88 years old. He was in the hospital. And just put it bluntly, he was preparing to die. His time was not much on this earth. He'd been a Christian his whole life. And this man went to visit him. He's 25 years old. And he asked him, he said, would you mind if I prayed with you? And the guy said, oh, of course. He said, well, what do you want? What do you want us to pray about? And he said, these words haunt me to this day, that man, that 88-year-old man, had been a Christian his whole life, said these words. He said, well, just pray that I've been good enough to make it into heaven. Did you hear what I said? He said, just pray that I've been good enough to make it into heaven. Anything wrong with that? Nobody's good enough. But I'm going to tell you, if we can make it to 88 years old And I'm looking around in here, and there's a whole lot of you been Christians a long, long time. But when you're 88 years old, I want to tell you something. I want you to know that you are going to heaven when you die. I don't care if you're 46 years old. I want you to know that. And the only way that we can know that is if we have a relationship with Jesus Christ. And that's who we're talking about this whole entire year. That's who. Remember, the signpost is pointing us to Jesus. We have to have relationship. We have to have. He's got to be living in us, pointing the way to heaven. We've got to be alive with Him. And when we're like that, we can show other people that. But we can know that we are going there. In Isaiah chapter 61, verse 1 and 2. Let's read those first two verses. It says, the Spirit, I got to get my breath, man. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the afflicted. I like that word afflicted, but the old King James used a different word. It used the word meek. And sometimes long ago, I know I've heard people think, or people say that they thought, well, meekness was weakness. But that's not true. That is not true. But I'll ask us the question, have any of us, like the situations that I listed that we may be going through when we're approaching God in prayer, has there been a time in your life that you've been afflicted? I see some of you, I'm not going to tell on you, but some of you are nodding your head like this. There's time. And I know there are, because, well, I can speak for myself. There's been times like that. But I'll tell you, there's been times when I look at others, I haven't been afflicted like brother so-and-so, and I hadn't been afflicted like sister so-and-so. But you know what? I've been on my knees in prayer for them, and I hope the same. I'm convinced that if we spend our time praying for one another and not necessarily for ourselves, nothing wrong with praying for yourself. But if we spend our time praying for one another, and you prayed for me and I prayed for you, I'm going to tell you, we'd all be a lot better off. To bring good news to the afflicted. Notice that did not say, I love to look at what the Bible doesn't say. It did not say that it would bring death and decay and heartache on the afflicted. It said good news. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted. I'll just ask you, I've asked this question before. Have any of you in here, don't answer this except to yourself. Have any of you in here ever been brokenhearted? Now again, there's some of you who are answering with a nod of the head in the affirmative. And we know that is true. We know that is true. Wilson Adams' daddy used to say there was a broken heart in every congregation. And Wilson said that after he started preaching, he found out that his dad was wrong. He said, because Dad, there's a broken heart in every pew. And I think that's correct. To proclaim liberty to the captives. The meek are those who are humble, lowly, gentle. We're meek. We're afflicted. He didn't come just to preach, but to provide blessings. Captives there in verse 1. You could also use the word debtors, slaves. This verse here references Leviticus 25 and 10 or Jeremiah 34, 8 and 15. It's the 50th year. It's the year of Jubilee, where those were released. Freedom to prisoners. Don't raise your hand. How many of you in here have been a prisoner? Don't raise your hand, okay? How many of you ever known a prisoner? I've known a prisoner. I know a guy that works in a prison. I don't want that job. I don't think he wants that job. It just pays money. To proclaim the favorable or acceptable, the King James says, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn. What's He here to do? What's He here to do? Any answer? Free us. Sometimes in the world that we live in, let's make it a little, in the country that we live in, we don't necessarily know what it's like not to be free, do we? We don't know what it's like to be owned by another human being. Sometimes we have trouble with that. He's here to provide us freedom. Jesus had power. Let's look at Acts chapter 10. In Acts chapter 10, verse 38. Acts chapter 10, verse 38. You know of Jesus of Nazareth, how God anointed him with the Holy Spirit and with power, and how he went about doing good and healing all who were oppressed by the devil. For God was with him. So with that power, he'll do what? What's he going to do for us? Free us. Oh, it's different when somebody else gets free. But we have to make this personal. This is about roles. It's great when we talk about, for God so loved the world, He gave His only begotten Son, but that's all encompassing, isn't it? It's all encompassing. But you go to Galatians 2:20, that's John 3:16 personified. That's taught about me and you. It's not talking about the whole world. The whole world, when I think about the whole world, well, that doesn't necessarily include me, even though it does. I'm not that stupid to think it doesn't include me. But we're talking about me and you. You put your name in it. We're talking about, I'm not calling you out, Nancy, but it's talking about Nancy. It's talking about Gary. It's talking about Brad. It's talking about Jack. Jeff, you had a comment? Oh, I thought, okay. That's important to us. Let's look back at Isaiah, 3 different verses in Isaiah for just a moment. In Isaiah chapter 40. I should have had you keep your finger there. Isaiah 40 and verse 9. Isaiah 40, verse 9. It says, Get yourself up on a high mountain, O Zion, bearer of good news. Lift up your voice mightily, O Jerusalem, bearer of good news. Lift it up. Do not fear. Say to the cities of Judah, Here is your God. Now turn on over a couple of pages to Isaiah 41 and 27. In Isaiah 41:27, it says, Formerly I said to Zion, Behold, here they are, and to Jerusalem I will give a messenger of good news. Now turn on over to Isaiah 52. Isaiah 52 verse 7. It says, How lovely on the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, who announces peace and brings good news of happiness, who announces salvation and says to Zion, Your God reigns. Christ, our prophet and teacher, God has spoken in and through His Son. Now let's go back to the New Testament, Matthew chapter 7. In Matthew chapter 7, verse 29. Matthew chapter 7, I want you to think about as we read this passage that He was the master teacher. Verse 29 says, For He was teaching them, notice this, as one having authority, and not as their scribes. Here's a question. We've got to answer this question. Does Jesus have anything to offer these people? This means yes, this means no. Does Jesus have anything to offer these people? Yes. They've been listening to the Sermon on the Mount there in Galilee. Does Jesus have anything to offer the world today? That's the second question. Yes. Here, third question. Does Jesus have anything to offer you? Yes. Yes. Did Jesus have the authority? Yes. Where'd he get it from? God. That's how we're going to reach the world. There are people in our world that we come in contact with every day. That are hurting, that are looking for something. I talked to a young man who was about, I'm going to guess him to be about 30 years old. It's been a month and a half, 2 months ago. He knows about the Bible. Not living. He's not living. You know, he's not, Jesus is not in him. Matter of fact, he's never obeyed the gospel. And he told me, I don't have any reason to doubt him, but he said these words. He said, I don't know what it is, but something's missing in my life. I've known this young man a long time. And all I kept thinking about was that was convicting me because, man, did I let him down? I'm trying to point him to Jesus. And he's got his health. He's got a job. He's got a family. He's got a mother. But something's missing in his life, and he can't figure out what it is. But he knows it's missing. The thing about that is I got the answer. Not because I'm smart, but I know what's missing. We all know what's missing. But we got to point him and them to Jesus. Jesus had the authority. Well, let's talk about this for a minute. We'll stop right here, and we'll start here Wednesday night. But let's talk about this for a minute. What about these scribes we just talked about? How did they handle the law to the people? Oh, Rose, they acted as experts. You an expert on that? No, they acted as experts. Kind of like the people that was on the hill up there. But let me ask you this question. Did they put all their faith and confidence in knowing that? It was. If they had I don't think they had overalls back then, but if they were wearing overalls back then, they'd had both thumbs in them overalls, and they'd been pushed out like that, wouldn't they? And bowed back because they knew it all. I guess class is out, isn't it? Andy's shaking his head. Y'all think about that. We'll begin there on Wednesday evening. We're going to talk some more about Jesus being the prophet and a whole lot about him being the teacher.